Welcome to the podcast. Appreciate you joining us as always. What is a biblical marriage? It is when two people decide that they are going to live together as husband and wife, and they're going to be faithful to each other for the rest of their days, and they are joined in the one flesh relationship of physical intimacy. God joins them together. The Bible says concerning marriage, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. When do you think that happens? Do you honestly believe God joins two people together when they exchange vows in a church? Do you think that God joins them together when the preacher says, I now pronounce you husband and wife? When in Genesis chapter 2, when God instituted marriage, he said, the two shall become one flesh. That's what a marriage is. And we can prove that in so many ways in the Bible. Like I said, it's one of the simplest doctrines in the Bible is what constitutes a biblical marriage. But you remember in Genesis 29, I've said there are no wedding ceremonies in the Bible. They may be good, well, fine, all of that. They're not required, and they are not biblical. That's not what happened in the Bible. They did have feasts or parties to celebrate marriages, but they did not have wedding ceremonies. If we would understand that, there'd be a lot less judgmentalism, because a lot of people think they've only been married one time because they've only had one ceremony and all that sort of nonsense. But we'll get into that later. But in Genesis 29, a guy named Jacob, Isaac's boy, Abraham's grandson, falls in love with a woman named Rachel. And he talks to her father and gets permission to marry her. And so he works for 7 years. That's the agreement. Her father says, you work for me for 7 years, and you can be married to Rachel. He works for 7 years. There is a feast celebrating this great moment. And then the Bible says, and it's right there in Genesis 29, read it. They went into the tent, and they were married. Where were they married? In the tent. I don't have to spell that out for you, do I? Problem is, he wakes up the next day, and it's not Rachel. Jacob married the wrong woman. His father-in-law tricked him. He said, how could you do this to me? What's going on here? And, of course, Lamech, his father-in-law, said, well, I got to marry off the oldest one first. Why didn't you tell me this beforehand? What a jerk. What a terrible trick to play on somebody. So he gives him to marry Leah, the oldest daughter. Jacob wants to marry Rachel, but he actually marries Leah. He marries the wrong woman. Now, how in the world could that possibly happen if there were wedding ceremonies? Is Jacob so stupid that he could stand next to a woman and not know that it's not her, the woman that he loves, the woman he's worked for 7 years to be with? He loves her so much, he doesn't know the sound of her voice. I mean, this is so ridiculous, it's almost even hard to talk about without cracking up. The reason he married the wrong woman is because in the darkness of a tent, with her wearing a veil, he became one flesh with the wrong woman. So then he goes to Lamech, his father-in-law, and says, how could you do this to me? Lamech says, I tell you what, work 7 more years, you can have Rachel too. But Jacob does it because he wants to be married to Rachel, and he loves Rachel. And the Bible says that he took Rachel into the tent. I mean, this is actually word for word. And she became his wife. Where did she become his wife? In the tent. The biblical definition of what a marriage is simple, not difficult to understand at all. So either Jacob is the dumbest man who ever lived in the history of the world, or what we're saying about a biblical marriage is true. And you need to just accept what the Bible teaches. What constitutes a biblical marriage? It is between a man and a woman when they decide to live as husband and wife, to be committed to each other faithfully for the rest of their lives, and have the one flesh relationship. God joins them together. Let not what God has joined together be put asunder. And God joins you together when you make that agreement to be husband and wife and have the one flesh relationship. Now, that's what we've said, and people say, you're wrong. There's more to it than that, because Jesus went to a wedding. I've said there's no wedding ceremonies in the Bible. You know why I've said that, though? Let me tell you why I've said that. Because there are no wedding ceremonies in the Bible. But Jesus turned water into wine in a wedding ceremony. No, he did not. Read it. John chapter 2. Stop just believing things because people have told you. That's not healthy. All right? Now, some translations call that a wedding, but that's not a wedding like what you're thinking of. And I know that because it says that he went to a wedding feast and turned water into wine. Now, they had a feast to celebrate the marriage, but they did not have a wedding ceremony. Somebody says, but he turned water into wine at it. Who turns water into wine at a wedding ceremony? Who eats and drinks at a wedding? So they're up there. Is that, well, we don't believe that they were up there before the priest or whatever. They were exchanging vows, and Jesus turned water into wine during that time. Oh, no. No, preacher. It was the reception. Then where's the wedding in the text? Read it. It only says he went to the feast, or some translations call it a wedding, but it was a feast celebrating a marriage, because he went there and they ran out of wine and he turned the water into wine, not at a wedding ceremony, but at a feast, because there's only one event there. So where is this mystical ceremony? It's amazing how people will go to the thing where Jesus turned water into wine. They don't want to go there when we're talking about moderate consumption of alcohol. But boy, when it fits their purposes, they'll run there and make a beeline there. That in no way contradicts what we've said about marriage. All right, and then there's the one about Deuteronomy 24. Because a man was required to give his wife a certificate of divorce when they separated or when they got divorced, then that means there had to be some sort of official legal marriage involved. No, not at all. Here's what a biblical marriage is. Man and woman decides to live together as husband and wife, to be faithful to each other for life, and they are joined in the one flesh relationship. God joins them together. That's what a marriage is, one of the simplest doctrines in the Bible. Easy to understand. A certificate of divorce in Deuteronomy 24 does not in any way negate that. So just picture it. Here's a man and a woman that have decided to live together. The man all of a sudden decides he's going to kick her out. Now, everybody in town knows that though they are married, knows that they've been married. And he decides he doesn't want her anymore, so he kicks her out. And he wants to be cruel to her, to really make her pay for whatever it is she did. So he refuses to acknowledge the divorce. So she can't go and be someone else's wife. God says, you're not going to do that. You cannot put her away. If you're going to put her away, you're going to have to give her a certificate of divorce. In other words, you're going to have to write it out. I have put her away, and she is no longer mine, and she is free to go marry someone else. And one part of that people overlook and ignore is he says, if you then decide, once you give her that divorce, that bill of divorce, you change your mind and want to take her back, you cannot marry her back. Illegal. You can't do it. When you put her out and give her that certificate of divorce, you can't marry her back. Now, who teaches that? Who teaches that once a man and his wife get divorced legally, that they cannot later on decide to get back together? Well, if you're going to use the certificate of divorce to try to contradict what we're teaching about marriage, then that would mean you couldn't even marry your own wife back. You couldn't even marry her back. It's not at all. That has no bearing whatsoever on what we're teaching, all right? So remember that. Just because he would not let them kick their wives out and be cruel to them does not in any way negate what we've said about biblical marriage.